Okay, guys, it's 4 o'clock. Scott, no, go ahead and do that. Want to welcome everybody back. Happy Thanksgiving time, Merry Christmas time. We'll work this in between all of the holidays. How's that? We want to thank everybody for all of the work that's been done to date. Bill told me a little bit ago that our first meeting was in February of 2014. So I guess we've done anything but rush this through. So let's go ahead and begin. The first item on the agenda is to approve the minutes of July 31st of 2017. Jeff has given you a handout and you've had the minutes for a week or so. Are any changes or additions or corrections to the minutes?
Yes, sir.
If not, I would entertain a motion for approval.
So moved. Second.
Motion made and second to approve the minutes, made by Lisa, second by Nancy. All in favor, aye? Aye. Opposed? That passes. Oh, that passes everybody but John as an abstention. Next item on the agenda is to receive the written public comments. And one of the things before we start here, we've probably all received a number of emails, about, the public comment section, how we are going to incorporate all of those or some of them, whatever is going to come out of the comments received from the public. And one of the things that just throw out for the committee to talk about just for a second, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't see how we can get to a point today in a 2-hour period of going over all these comments about having an item to be, or a plan to be able to vote on and recommend to go to the Planning Commission. I think this is something that after our discussion and after we give direction on the items that we have, that we will bring up. Staff has a number of recommendations in here. I know each one of us probably have recommendations or things that we would like to see maybe changed in the document to have this cleaned up and brought back before the committee at least another time to have a final vote to go forward. I think that we have wanted to make sure that this is a public process, one that everybody feels comfortable with when it's done, and I think that that's kind of where we need to be. Anything?
That actually is what I was going to suggest as well. I think that we've had a really, really long and very public and transparent process. However, at the very end here, we don't want to make just stumble over a moment where folks are asking for our time and attention a little bit more before we turn this over. I don't think we are, in my opinion, I don't think we're far off from what we need to turn over to the commissions, but I think that we have a lot to talk about today, and especially since it's been a while since we've been together and we want to make sure we have a thorough conversation. I'd be supportive of Mike's comment.
Okay. Anyone else?
Agreed.
Okay. Everybody? Okay. Well, with that, then we'll go ahead and go on to receiving of the written public comments. Scott, do you have any things that you want to bring up on that?
Co-chairs, I appreciate your opening comments there, and I think staff wholeheartedly agrees that this needs a little bit more attention paid. We set up the agenda for that possibility, but I think we agree that the comments sent in, first of all, we appreciate a lot. I know you all do too, because a lot of the members of the public spend a lot of time reviewing the work to date, and so we really appreciate that. And many of the comments kind of reflect some conflict within the plan that we didn't see as we wrote it, so I think that's good to be able to have some other eyes on it from that perspective. And as we talk about this today, I think what we need to do is have some authority at the end of the day to go in, look at all the comments, and make some of the decisions about many of them ourselves, and sort of as a staff group, look at those and take the reasonable ones, make the changes as we think we have heard you direct us to do on so many things, but we need some of that higher level guidance and direction on some of the issues that we note in our memo. And so we weren't prepared necessarily to go through all of the written comments. I don't think you would enjoy that process either. There's something like 117 pages worth or so. What we are prepared to do is present sort of a summary of the plan for yours and maybe the public's and the viewers at homes. Getting back into the plan a little bit, note the highlights. It's about a 10-minute or so presentation. Jeff can give you a summary of it. And then maybe turn our attention to the big items of maybe debate or highlights through the public comment period, and then turn that over to you and have you discuss those issues, give us some general guidance and direction, put us back to work with revising the plan. I hate to say this, but on some level, we probably owe it to the public to respond to all of the comments in some form or fashion, kind of one by one, point by point. Jeff, we're here to be kicking me under the table or even outside of the table. But I think that if we've asked them to provide that much time and energy to it, we owe it to them to respond to the comments to the best of our ability so that the steering committee sees that dialogue and exchange of ideas and issues, and then you can make some final decisions once you see some of that work. At some point, though, we do need to move it on through the process and get it up to what will be a whole new round of debate and dialogue and discussion. You all know that, but I agree, we need to take some time with it here. So with those comments, we're kind of prepared to give you a brief PowerPoint presentation and get you back acclimated with some of the higher points of the plan, if that's okay.
Well, Scott, I appreciate your comments, and one of the things that I do want to say, and I'm glad you brought it up, the amount of work that members of the public, did on their comments. I mean, it was really incredible to read, and there was some folks that did some real work in going down line at a time and chapter by chapter and just spelled it all out. So we really appreciate all the time that people spend doing that. So. Are there any questions of Scott on this so far? Okay, presentation time.
So as Jeff prepares, I might just prime the pump by talking about how different of a plan this is than Horizon 2020. I don't want to lose sight of that because it does several things different. It incorporates the work of some of the experts in our community on so many different items: transportation, sustainability, food systems, environmental, all of those things. It leans much more heavily on sector plans to reflect the logical, compatible land use patterns, as something the Horizon 2020 didn't have the benefit of its time. And I think it reflects some bold steps to become more financially, economically, and environmentally sustainable and resilient, something that weren't even buzzwords at the time of the Horizon 2020. And so I'll turn it over, and Jeff can give us a summary of the plan today.
Good afternoon. Go through it real briefly, just like I said, very quick, high-level presentation, kind of covering some of the bigger items that was in the plan, and just some background in case you all mentioned. Mr. Ackerley noted, the steering committee has been doing 18 months or more public input throughout the process. It first set in February of 2014, and you had the issue action report that you created. It had 19 key issue items in there, 6 that you identified as being a priority, 2 of which I'm happy to report we can already consider being crossed off. One was the update of the Parks and Rec Master Plan by the City of Lawrence. That was completed, actually kind of going on during the issue action report, but it's been wrapped up and is now ready for incorporation by reference into this plan possibly. And also enhancing the readability of the plan, which I think you kind of see in the text in the document and the way that it works today. So the key really big updates that we've always been talking about from the very beginning is the readability and the continuity of the document. Horizon 2020 kind of was piecemealed together at some points. There were some chapters that didn't quite align with the way the formats all worked in the previous chapters. So we brought that continuity back into the document. We introduced interactive mapping, which we did get some comments about that one. A lot of those involve just needing to click on the map to make it activate and turn on. But we do have the interactive maps that are working and available and have been updating. So as parcels have changed or as different things have changed in the county, those have stayed up to date as they go along. One of those would be street names. Actually, a couple new streets have come online, so they show up in the maps already. So we've been talking about the reference plans, just like the Parks and Rec Master Plan, just bringing those items into and making it part of the document. We've always said this from the very beginning, is Horizon 2020 did us a very good foundational work, but it was a heavy lifter. It carried a lot of the weight that a lot of the sector plans and some of our specific land use plans now are not having to carry. So that's kind of dialing it back a little bit in that respect. It's important to remember that this is not the subject matter expert that it needs to be anymore. We have other plans that fill that subject matter expert role. So Food Policy Council, a cultural arts plan, sustainability plans. So they've kind of taken that lead where Horizon 2020 used to have to do all the work. We also have some new additions coming into the plan. So you'll see housing in neighborhoods and affordable housing coming into the plan. Some other ones we'll talk about a little bit as we go along. Really the big kind of high-level changes that we've been talking about are growth and development chapter, which we took 4 previous chapters and combined them into one and really just laced them together to make it a little bit of a more seamless find for both the public and also for planning commissioners and staff to look at. But it really starts looking at the variety and types of housing in the community and how those are situated and located around town. It also references and talks about the Affordable Housing Advisory Board, which is a board by the City of Lawrence to kind of work on those issues and start incorporating their findings into the bigger document. One thing we heard in the public comment period was the drive for infill development, and kind of start talking, having that density discussion kind of comes along with that. And we think there's some different ways that the plan is starting to address those items and kind of introducing some of those new elements that we've been talking about for a while that we heard the public have some interest in throughout the county. So we're kind of introducing those at this point. And of course, this is where we start kind of going down into the nuts and bolts and the math side of things, which is one of my favorites. So I will try to keep the numbers to an absolute minimum here and not be too much of a math person. What we started to look at was the old service areas that you see in Horizon 2020 and start reformatting them and recompiling them in a way that fits with what we're seeing on the land today. And this is where we start getting into the growth tiers that you see there. The 3 tiers are Tier 1, which is the blue tier, which is the current city limits. Tier 2 is where we think we're reasonably going to annex in the next 20 years based on our growth that we have right now. And Tier 3 we think is going to be beyond the plan's time horizon. So it's still in the urban growth area, but it's just beyond the 20-year scope where we think this plan will cover. So one thing we've always talked about is showing that, but we never really kind of give you an idea of what that looks like when the computer moves through the motions to start eliminating places. So this is kind of a very rudimentary way of how it handles things. So it starts with this. It starts with Tier 1, which is the city limits of Lawrence. And then we start feeding it different parameters and saying, you can or you can't go here. The first one we start going is our future land use and our sector plans. So it starts identifying the lands that we've already have available. It looks at our fire and medical response, 6-minute response rates. It starts looking at where we can reasonably serve the utilities in the community. So water, wastewater, sewer. And we start looking at where floodways are. So we eliminate those because people don't like to live on water. And that's how Tier 2 gets developed. It's really a combination of the things that we can provide services to, and then we start removing the things that we know they're going to be detriments. Floodways, sensitive lands, those items. They start coming off the map, and that is how Tier 2 gets generated. So then you start seeing the whole map pull way back together again. So it's the first time you've seen this. We've actually went back, got some new numbers from some different people. We've actually completed some other reports that we do in the office, and we've got revised numbers for the growth capacity inside those items there. Lawrence's estimated population in 2017 is just about under 100,000 people. You go through and you start looking at the infill capacity in Lawrence with some of the general items that we have, assumed density rates, certain housing units, things like that. It works out that we have enough land in the city of Lawrence currently to accommodate just over 17,000 more residents. And then we start having the computer move through Tier 2 and say, what is the capacity of that green space on the map? And it figures out to be about 18,500. This would lift the population of Lawrence to right around 135,300. And at our current growth rate, which is a little high for us right now, so we're kind of going on the higher side a bit, works out to be about 2050 is when we'd run out of land in that space. So we also kind of introduced with the growth tiers is this element of a community benefit. And one thing that we put in here was we took a lot of the comments that we heard from the public comment periods, from the forums, the ETC surveys, and started looking at what a community benefit may include. We didn't try to make an all-inclusive list that encompassed everything possible, because that may change over time. But we just wanted to give people a general idea of what a benefit may include, such as a permanent affordable housing, facilities for public purposes, protection of environmental sensitive land, or the creation of an employment opportunity. We heard lots about primary job creation, so we figured that would be a very good stepping off point. So that's kind of how the general concept of a community benefit came together. And kind of as we start going through the chapters again, we mentioned earlier about environment and sensitive lands, but we really redefined how sensitive lands show up in the plan. We expanded that definition to include some things that wasn't there originally. So floodplain and habitat protection start entering in here, including native prairies and those items. We also expand the floodplain protections to where if you're newly annexed land, you cannot build in the floodplain. We just go ahead and step that one out there and really get in line with what we've heard with the community. We also start making reference to those climate change items that we've heard about along the way, both in the Chapter 16 update of Horizon 2020 and with this update plan. And we're kind of setting up the groundwork for those subject matter experts to get in with a climate change adaptation plan. It's been something that's been in the works for the Sustainability Office for a while, and we want to make sure that we're not necessarily getting in the way of it, but we want to make sure that this document is set up for when that one comes along, that we can take those expert opinions and work them into the document. Community resources is a really good one to kind of talk about how we kind of changed the way that the plan looks and shapes. We've added local foods and the arts and culture chapters to the document. They are subsets in the community resource plan. Parks and recreation comes in here because it's a great community resource that we have in both the city and the county. And we spend a lot of time kind of covering the ground about downtown Lawrence, and its role is beyond just being the heart of the community. It's some of its jobs and the way it affects the arts, the way that we kind of view that community asset and bringing it in, because we recognize it is a very big resource to our community. We also talk about economic development. We all remember the ETC survey with employment and primary jobs being very high vote respondents in that thing there. So this plan really works to align the efforts of our partners in the community with the document itself. So it kind of really ties those two back together. It works towards the retention of our existing industries and businesses, the attraction of newer ones, and also working with our small businesses to kind of get a leg up and get going. But also works towards those other things that we just don't know yet, those emerging economies that we can see coming, but we don't know how it will be. So trying to lay that groundwork as best we can. So that's kind of the really high level, 10-minute quick presentation of it. But I think the key topics to keep in mind as we're discussing today is that growth management. How do we handle the infill and the density? How do we do sustainability and climate change in the planning and kind of get it ready for those other items coming forward? Looking at primary jobs and the economic development portion of it, and definitely making sure that affordable housing is integrated into our neighborhood and housing chapter, and trying to tie that all in as best we can. So with that, I'd be glad to stand for any questions you have, and turn it over to Scott.
I might just expand. If you go back to your tier map, you'll see throughout some of the comments some questions regarding sort of how we got to this system and why not other areas of the community. For example, the wastewater treatment plant is south of the Wakarusa, and does that not open up areas for development? Well, it certainly could. It certainly could. And from our perspective, after we took all things into consideration and the way the growth is going today, and how much land we felt we needed to accommodate the growth for this time frame, we felt like and because of budget restraints and constraints and the cost of development and maintaining development that the whole city and county take up, we thought that this plan should help focus and guide development to areas that were able to support it in a least costly fashion was one criteria. So I think if you take that set of criteria into account, this is sort of the easy plan to reach conclusions on. The harder time frame will be after this growth comes to the community, and if the community keeps growing after that, where do we put our resources then? Is it south of the wastewater treatment plant, where there's a large watershed that could accept at least sewer? You still have water to get and roads to develop. Is it down Highway 59, where you have a major highway that, usually development follows transportation as well? So when we looked at those options, we felt like this was the best option for this planning period, knowing that there will be new decisions to make down the line. It takes all of those layers of criteria that we talked about, where infrastructure is planned, where it's least costly to extend, where the fire department is able to get to, all of those things into consideration, and this is what we think the conclusions are drawn. There certainly are other conclusions to be drawn. I would challenge the group to consider the cost of some of those conclusions to the community, because the community maintains development after it's put into the ground. And so that's a little bit of where we're at. So for us, annexation and growth is about timing and community benefit that the project can build. And from a timing perspective, we have laid out a policy that infill is the priority. So we will use our new tools of reviewing housing markets, commercial markets, multifamily, and getting to the industrial market as tools, not the end-alls of, housing is X, so Y must occur, but just as a way for our planning commission and governing bodies to assess new projects and new growth outside of the existing city limits. I think it's going to come sooner rather than later because we're up against our limits. And while we do have some infill capabilities on certain types of product, we need to grow our community, the city of Lawrence anyway, in other types of housing products. So it's kind of messy, but I just wanted to share a little bit deeper what the criteria was that we used to reach these conclusions. Put it in context as you read through the communications that you'll see.
Scott, can you clarify on Tier 1, is that just the current city limit?
It is.
Or is that the limits of our utility service area?
No, well, they're pretty much one and the same right now. Yes.
They're identical. So there's water, sewer, and power to the edges of that legal area?
Yes.
Scott, in our mapping capabilities, do we have the ability under Tier 1 to show what is available for development, what's not developed right now?
We do have reports that we generate that show the vacant areas of development. We do. Mm-hmm.
And your estimate of lots right now that are lots available,
Mm-hmm.
property available for development within inside Tier 1. Any idea what that is right now?
Well, the last report, which was published, I think, January this year, there was somewhere roughly around 7 years, if I recall, of single-family lots overall. We divide that category into newer subdivisions within 10 years of recording the plat, and then overall subdivisions. So the newer subdivisions are yielded about 2.5 years of capacity. Now, since then, we've added some major projects to the mix, so it's a kind of a continuous look each year of what's come on and what's dropped off. When we did our multi-dwelling inventory, there's well above 20 years of inventory. Now, there are a lot of caveats to those things, which is that we don't control when those things go to market. We don't control a lot of the market in that regard, although policies can either open up or stifle markets, and you see some of that conversation taking place in the communications in the packet. And so all of those things need to be considered, but we think we've got some capacity inside the city limits to put both commercial, industrial, and housing in place for a little while yet. But we need to look at it every year. We need to do an assessment of what that looks like.
In the Tier 1, and the estimates that you provided show an increase in population of about 17,000 over the life of the document here. What's the proposed density per acre? Any idea?
Do we know? Have we
It
done
works
that?
out in 3 different forms. It assumes there's a downtown density, a multi-dwelling density, and a local density. And then kind of works its way out from there. But it also looks at the future land use plans for every area and makes an assumption that you're going to be going for the higher portion. So a high density is usually 16 plus dwelling units an acre. Low would be 5 to 7, somewhere in that vicinity. But usually what it works its way through is the higher end of the spectrum, just assuming a quicker rate would occur based on our permit pool. More or less, it works out to be about 18 units, I think 18 units per acre off the top of my head for multifamily development. Works out to be about 5.5 for a single family development pattern that we tend to see in the city. Those numbers may be a little bit off. I'm just pulling those out of memory right now, but right in that range.
And there's not a conflict created with the city's strategic plan and their support of, strong neighborhoods by having that kind of density?
The single-family density is pretty close to what you tend to see on the west side of town. As you move back into East Lawrence, the density starts coming back up above 7 for the most part, starts getting a little bit more dense. It's all a matter of how it's kind of entered into the land development code. I think it's one of those key aspects of how density shows up. People tend to think of density as just being a 7-story building being dropped into the neighborhood, but there are ways of designing for high density that don't look high density. They don't have the feel about it. So there's lots of details that come into that as we start talking about the policies when they start coming down from the goals and plan and showing up in the land development code.
So as we're talking about density, it seemed like a lot of the commentary that pushed back on the kind of the mandatory inclusion of affordable housing or different kinds of housing inside new developments, or the pushback was that was inclusionary zoning, that's not an acceptable or even legal mandate coming from the local government in terms of state statute and all of that. So it seems like whenever we've talked about, and one of the solutions to that was suggested would be incentives, and some of those incentives would be like awarding higher density. That might be an acceptable kind of a compromise. And so I know we've talked about needing to establish the tool that would give developers higher density in areas that we are not used to higher density in the Affordable Housing Task Force, and we've talked about it here. I'm wondering, what is the process finally to having that tool kind of in hand so that we can show what is the reward for including affordable housing in a new development, to kind of help this conversation along, so we're not at loggerheads with each other, kind of empty-handed on the tool side.
That's a great question, and one of the difficulties with some of this is that the policies need to be transferred into some codes and some other rules. And we have a lot going on right now in the community. Affordable housing, while it's been with us for a long time, it's really ramped up very aggressively the last couple of years, thanks to the governing body's desire to do some things, and then the voters' desire to pass a sales tax. So we have 10 years worth of revenue, which in my mind I get very excited about the possibilities of partnering with a new project that either is infill or annexation, and the possibilities of partnering with different groups in the community like nonprofits and home builders, and using those funds in a creative way to get the most bang for the buck, right? But all of that's spinning around a number of people's minds, I think. It's very hard to put on paper in a policy in the comp plan. And so I know no one accepts, trust me, this will all sort of work out in the end. But I think the answer is that some of those things come later. Once we get the framework established in the comp plan, some of those things come later in developing programs through the Affordable Housing Board and ultimately City Commission, and then development code changes, which we've done a few over the years to incentivize density. I think there's opportunity to do more with preserving extraordinary sensitive lands. City of Lawrence has already put into the economic development policies requirements and incentives to incent affordable housing. And so that's kind of new to it. So a lot of things are coming about very quickly and very new in our processes. So I can't give you probably the specifics, Commissioner Thellman, that you're looking for to break the loggerhead, because it's going to be sort of a bit of an experimental and messy process in the early days of this, until I think the housing board and governments and the governing bodies work out their final programs and how to allocate that funding that's very recently been approved by the voters. Am I answering the question at all?
Well, I mean, I'm not talking about just housing that's developed through the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, but developers who want to go out and open up new neighborhoods in the city, and we're asking them to have a more varied kind of housing.
Sure.
So
So the way annexations work today is, and it's a very pro-growth, I would argue pro-sprawl approach. An owner comes to the city and says, I want to annex and get served by services. And we put an ordinance on the city commission agenda, and we annex them into the city. And all the policies of Horizon 2020 today support that and really encourage aggressive annexation. We're proposing to change the mindset of that, almost to create a little competition amongst those who want to gain the services which give them value to the property, challenging them to think about the community benefit they could provide. And affordable housing isn't a requirement to get annexed. When you read the text, it calls for a community benefit is provided, and then it lists what is included, what a community benefit may include. Affordable housing is one, provision of land for public purpose, provision of preserving more environmental sensitive land if they're present, so on and so forth. So it's really very context sensitive and context based. If somebody approaches the city of Lawrence for 200 acres of land and they've got some amazing sensitive lands that could easily convert to park space, it becomes more of a negotiation and an analysis of the context about what that community benefit is versus just bring me in, give me service, and we'll go from there. So it really is a change in thinking about annexing and growing our community in a way that provides some sort of community benefit. But I think it's very context sensitive. I think it will be a different way of looking at annexations by the Planning Commission and the governing bodies, but that's what we're proposing with this plan update.
So you're not, I guess I just want to be clear, then the charge that this new tiered system is inclusionary zoning in disguise, that it needs legal evaluation to see if we can even do this.
Well, a couple of things. One is we wouldn't be requiring anything. The applicant would be bringing their proposal to the city for consideration, and they would have to demonstrate what the community benefit is that they're proposing. And then we enter into a discussion about the community's needs versus what they can provide. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is, I have discussed this a little bit with City Attorney's Office. We disagree that this is any form of inclusionary zoning when you look at the statute, so there's a disagreement there. So we still think this is a valid proposal as a plan policy. Again, it's but one of many plan policies that we could end up with. But
thank you.
You bet. And I would say, I think that one of the direction we would like from this committee, perhaps today, if you can give it, is sort of that affirmation or redirection on this idea that annexing into the city of Lawrence is viewed differently with this plan. You know, do you support the proposal as brought to you? Are there different ways? Should we keep to the pro-growth, sort of pro-annexation policy that we have in Horizon 2020 today? All of those things and everything in between those extremes, if you will, are sort of before you today.
Well, one of the things that I see us moving towards are creating winners and losers, and we're getting away from the free market for development in the community. And that's, you know, one of the things that I stand on. We've got to have free market. And when we start pulling away from that and start then creating winners and losers by what we develop, I believe this is getting too tight and not giving enough flexibility to be able to bring those things. I mean, if you're not growing, you're a dying community. It's no different in business. If you're not growing, you're dying. There's no status quo. And the things that we've started to put in place, and what I'm experiencing right now with infill development, we don't have anything in here for infill development other than saying that we're for it. but we don't have any tools that we've put in place for infill development. And it's one of the things that we talked about at the very beginning, infill development, infill development, infill development. I mean, we've had lots of discussions about that, but there's nothing in place to help perpetuate that. We're still in the same position we were before, and you and I have had those discussions about trying to figure out what we can do. And so between those two things, I think we have to do both. We have to figure out how to have our infill development that we can adjust accordingly, but we keep putting more constraints on any type of new development, and then we apply that to infill development on top of it, and it's just a gridlock. And if the intent is not to do anything and we want to stop moving, I guess it seems like that's the direction we're headed with it. And so, again, when we keep adding to everything and we don't have any overall view of where we're going, just like you asked, what do we want to do? Do we want to develop, or do we want to stop development? I mean, that's basically the question that you just laid out.
Oh, I hope
Right?
that's not what you heard.
Well, that's exactly what I heard. Because you
because-
said either it's development or it's not.
Well, I guess a couple of things around that. Cities don't, I mean, the cities and communities can do a lot to either spur development and growth or not, but we don't control development. Development is the accommodation of a growing community. Okay, so our policies won't determine if someone comes and moves here. What we do with economic
Well, that's not
development.
true. It
Well,
has to.
no, what I'm saying, what we can with our.
If you don't have a
economic-
house, you can't move here.
with our economic development policies and what KU does with their growth or expansion or not, those are the types of things that spur growth in the community. We're talking about how to accommodate growth. And so what we're proposing is a way to accommodate growth in terms of trying to do it in an orderly, efficient, least cost to the community fashion by directing growth to this area of either tier 1 or tier 2. And so put a little more analysis to it as those decisions, as those requests come in, not to stifle it in any form or fashion, but as we grow, what are the next couple of generations going to get for the growth that we do in the community? And that, I think, is part of the discussion. But in no way are we approaching this in a fashion that we're trying to limit or stifle growth. We very much understand that growth is occurring. We have a positive growth rate, and how do we accommodate that is the question.
How do you see the annexation process either changing, or what's it going to look like between the city and the county under a tier 2 annexation if this goes through?
Well, if it is an adjacent property asking for it, it really is, well, the addition to the process is probably an annexation agreement, and that annexation agreement begins to spell out the community benefits afforded the community and the development as annexation is considered. So that's the addition to it.
Both bodies have to agree to
It's
that
a-
agreement?
Commissioner Amyx, it depends on the type of annexation. If it's an island annexation, the county gets involved. If it's an adjacent annexation, the county does not get involved.
Okay. Does it create more of a political process? And the reason that I ask that, I mean, I can just see about what's to happen over the course of elections over time. And does it create more of a political process by having people who have been supported by whomever, you know?
It would add that component to it about looking at the community benefit. And so what you're likely doing, let's take, for example, a project that offers up affordable housing as a benefit, and the city agrees to commit a certain part of funding in some form or another to that cause. And so it becomes almost a negotiation of what the community will see at the end of the day to get those services for that development. And so the development prospers, the community prospers, and we fill a need that's recognized. And that need is recognized and defined by the governing body sitting at the time. And what we're trying to do is reflect a list of potential needs as they are today, not as they are necessarily even in the future.
But one of the things that I keep looking at are, as we continue to put more regulation on, we continue to spur the cost of housing. And our housing costs continue to rise the more we add. And so, I mean, I go back to, if you start limiting some of those things and start ratcheting them back, your cost of housing is going to come down. Instead of trying to create another form and have another group pay for it on top of it, because you just keep adding, and we're on this stair step to just keep adding.
I guess I don't see that this is adding regulation or is anti-growth. I think this is just asking for growth to follow where there's been an investment in infrastructure in an orderly way. So that, I mean, I guess the winners in all of this, I would think, would be taxpayers whose tax dollars are used to put down infrastructure and actually see that infrastructure used to its capacity, so that a city is actually able to afford the development that it's got, rather than finding it kind of scattered
and I agree with that.
So I don't think that's a winner-loser thing. I think that's just
I
good
agree with that
management.
wholeheartedly. I mean, I truly do. I mean, that's right. That's what we should be doing. But
Right.
when I go through the document to see what we're doing, all these restrictions that we're putting on place, and again, creating winners and losers for what we're doing, if we can bring our regulation down, we can bring our cost of housing down. It just gets passed on. So we go to do a development, or even an infill development, when we want to do something inside, the cost of doing that now is so high. I mean,
But I think the city
that's the part that I get frustrated
has
with.
an incentive.
but again, it's
package for
an
that.
incentive that raises the cost of the projects. And so all the cost of the projects go up, so your housing costs go up. I mean, they have to. There's no other way to do it. And that's just what we continue to do. And so I watch that continued spiral. And again, infill is the same thing. When I go to do an infill project, John and I have talked about this, we go do an infill project, and all of a sudden we're applying new standards to an infill project that, doesn't fit in that square peg, in the round hole. And so, again, so my frustration comes from truly doing it and also seeing where we're going. And we keep talking about all these things, but I look at them and go, we just keep climbing this ladder, and you're never ending. And so we need to figure out how to get that in check, is what I wholeheartedly believe. I mean, that's...
And I think the infill comments came through in a lot of the theme came through in a lot of comments that we received. That's the kind of topic that we're asking for you to put us to task with and bring something final back to you. But I think we agree that it's the Greenfield Code applied to a lot of the infill projects. We've done a little bit to try to give the staff some authority to grant waivers and variances, but I mean, we've got a community that doesn't want staff to have a lot of authority on some of these things either. So we have try to find a balance between those issues. And so a very engaged community is going to have some demands on these things.
What I'm hearing the concerns about, both in the public comment, what I'm hearing here, is one part might be related to how affordable housing and density is talked about. The connection to me isn't made, the strong connection isn't made. Density in and of itself will lead to affordable housing. In other words, affordable housing is not something that's given by an entity or that's created by an organization. Affordable housing is a function of density, size, and supply. That really is what creates affordable housing. I consulted with the Low Income Housing Institute for 7 years in Seattle, and they were very successful at getting grants at producing fairly advanced low-income housing product types, but they were entirely reliant on subsidization. It's not sustainable, and they knew that. In a community this size, even with the tax that was passed, we're never going to generate enough revenue to fully subsidize the low-income housing need, which means we've got to rely on the market for that. And maybe that's what you're getting at too, at Scott. And I think the fear that I'm hearing, which is shared with me, is if I look at something like 7.1 under the Tier 1 goals, is encourage a variety of housing types, there's a lot of great things in there, and I'm more interested in those things because they allow for a bottom-up approach. They let our citizens, our homeowners, our small landowners to participate in actually generating this density and generating this infill development as opposed to large-scale projects, which are a winner or loser proposal. if we can organically generate that density through some of the tools that are listed here, I think that that would start to address that. The fear is it's not in the code. And even though we pass this, that doesn't mean it's in the code. And what I hear people talking about is, just because we pass this, it doesn't give us the tools. It doesn't give me the tool as a homeowner to put an ADU on my lot, which is the best possible location for an ADU, close to a school, 6 blocks of downtown, in a neighborhood and a site that could use some redevelopment. And I think that's the fear that I'm getting, is that you said trust us, but is this going to get in the code?
I think you have to trust the process.
Yeah.
That's, ADUs is a good example of, we have twice tried to take the proposal for allowing accessory dwelling units in the RS5 zoning district because of all of the good planning values and that it aspires to meet, and have been met with pretty fierce opposition by those who live in RS5 districts. So there's that balance of process and engaged citizenry that is also at play here. And so, you know, ultimately this plan isn't the end. In a lot of ways, it's the beginning of moving forward in future and how to take on development, because it has been a very fluid document. It will continue to be a fluid document. And we're gonna have a lot of work to do to address the codes in it. And so if we come out of this plan with these kind of policies, we've already talked about a third attempt at ADUs in RS5, and maybe we get a better response once we kind of put more education to it or something.
Well, I think what some of us are looking for is the assurances that this plan is going to give both staff, and particularly the Development Commission and the City Commission, the conviction to stick to it. An activated citizenry has done a lot of stupid things that are destructive in communities all over the planet. And it's not a good enough excuse for not doing what's right for the community over the long term. Because oftentimes the short-term personal interest is not what's in the interest of the city, and I hope that this plan can give you as development director and the planning commission and the city commission the conviction to be able to stand up to that.
Patrick.
Couple of things. First, I want to thank the public for sending all those comments, because it gave me a different perspective on some of the things we've talked about for a long time, and the thought that so many people put in was really helpful. In thinking about Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, and Scott, you're asking for us to sort of, are you on the right track here? Some of the comments have me thinking of, and I'm going to try to do this as a metaphor, and I probably will mix it, so forgive me. But you know, when you read the goals section, it says Tier 1 is prioritized for development at any time. So that's like sea level to me. And then when we go to Tier 2, it says will only be annexed if the need to accommodate demand is established and if a community benefit is provided. But I think there's another threshold, another higher climb up the mountain, is that we've drawn where Tier 2 is. So while yes, I think at times we've asked, you know, there's been land that's been asked to be annexed, it may have been asked to be annexed in the yellow area in Tier 3, and we had no way to push that back. So I think the tiers is the right step, but I'm wondering if maybe the thresholds are in the wrong place, that we need to shift the threshold. Some of the comments about how difficult it is to do infill development. How can we incentivize, I think that's to your point, John, and maximize, and when you read, it says maximize development opportunities before expanding to Tier 2. This is within Tier 1. It seems like we need to incentivize or encourage, and so maybe we're going below sea level on that. Is my metaphor still working? Mm-hmm. So that we're actually doing everything we can to get people to develop in Tier 1. Because what we hear from developers is, the land that you have in Tier 1 doesn't work for me. So I want to go to Tier 2 or Tier 3. And the pushback we hear in some of this is, I want to be able to go to Tier 2 because you've made Tier 1 too difficult. So do we need to make tier 1 a little less difficult by strengthening and maximizing? And then maybe tier 2, I mean, if it says readily serviceable with utilities with minor system enhancements, well, that means we're ready for it, right? We've planned for that. We've drawn a green line around a certain area that maybe it's only when we get to tier 3 that we need to start looking at community benefit. And I know that feels like, oh, wait, we can force community benefit, but I'm wondering if maybe that threshold to tier 2 is too high, that maybe we need to think about, just from some of the feedback we got from the community, that maybe it needs to be tier 3 is where that threshold goes. I'm just renting this idea because it's a new perspective from the feedback we got from the public that I hadn't really, I guess I just hadn't got my mind around it totally. So I just share that for us to talk about.
I think to piggyback on that is that there's some very interesting research going on about the economic impact and development of certain areas. And one of the surprising results of some of these studies is the economic impact and development in what is considered poorer neighborhoods is often 10 times that of the impact of going out to tier 2 or tier 3. And the reason is because the infrastructure is already in place, but because there's an organic, much smaller size of business and smaller kind of household footprint, there's a much more diverse economic input and a much better tax revenue from those kinds of neighborhoods. And what's not in here is any type of a study, economic study on what that impact is. And that creates a measurable goal, which is far easier to succeed if we have something that is measurable, is understanding the economic impact of what that development is, or what the revenue generated is. Small changes in urban, closer-in neighborhoods can result in much bigger economic impacts and further reduced future costs to the city when we go to something like tier 2 or even on the outer edges of tier 1.
I wanted to just, I'm trying to think of what the appropriate metaphorical comeback would be, except I was gulping for air there for a moment. I was like swallowed a bunch of seawater on your last statement that maybe we need to just kind of go ahead and open up tier 2 without much resistance and just expect community benefits in tier 3. And I mean, the premise of this is that tier 3 isn't even foreseen to be developed within the life of this plan. And so, I mean, if we have worked all of this time to say that we really feel it's in the public's interest not to sprawl, and that we believe in this best practice of infilling and all of that, then I think that I mean, this is just the first feel of what it's going to be like, to the pushback from a community that's kind of used to just growing, you know, just growing wherever the impulse takes it. And this is a first attempt at saying we're gonna be, you know, really thoughtful in how we forever alter the land around our community, you know, to make it work for the population that lives here already and will live here in the generations. So I think we have to be really careful not to go there so easily that we would kind of do what we've always done, you know, to just say, well, you know, just annex it in and call it good.
I don't disagree with you. Like I said, I'm just renting it for a while.
Yeah.
I don't know that I agree with it. I just want to say it out
short-term
loud
lease.
and make sure that we're thinking that through. You know, I sort of feel like, well, so since we drew a line around tier 2, I think that's sort of preventing sprawl. I mean, that's one argument you could make, is that we've sort of said these are the spots where we're going. Therefore, it's not just sprawl. We're not just picking anywhere to go. We've been thoughtful about where that green line is for tier 2. Is that enough, or is that not enough of a threshold?
I don't know that that's enough. I mean, There's
Okay.
there's specific benefits that we want to be part of that development as it grows. So I think those benefits are what help us get, have that tier 2 development occur the way we're envisioning. So I do like the point about what are ways that we can make tier 1 developments.
And that goes back to the idea that I don't know how we have this conversation with a skeptical community and really folks who are really well versed in public process and what our history on development has been, unless we have examples, draft language, or tools at hand, not necessarily, you know, in our books yet, but at least things that can be seen and read and placed alongside these big ideas that can reassure folks that there are helps to that difficult infill development. You know, beyond, you know, the Affordable Housing Board, you know, the vast majority of the time and energy and money is going to go to the lowest, you know, the kind of housing that no one wants to develop, the kind that has to be subsidized. I mean, it's not, you know, I think there will be some policy conversations about how to make regular housing available for retirees who come here that's more affordable. But, you know, I think the general housing market, the general development scene, I think we're going to have, you know, planning tools, not necessarily money, but higher density, and to just think that people are going to trust us on that. I think is
Well, so I'm glad Mr. Kelly made the comments, because one of the things we're introducing with this plan is a little bit of the growth rate and what the areas we think can develop, can accommodate within this time horizon. And so the reason that Tier 2 exists in the form it does is that that's the area, along with Tier 1, that can accommodate the growth, actually longer than this time horizon a little bit. But if we were to go beyond that tier and then accommodate growth beyond that tier and put in the fire station, put in the water tower, put in the extra sewers, all of those, and bypass the land that could accommodate it without all of those things, you've paid a lot. The community has paid a lot to accommodate growth that could have been accommodated in an area that's already planned and more able to support the growth. So that's what we're saying. It's not that we can't grow in those areas. With enough money, we can grow just about anywhere, right? And the county commission's support to do island annexation, we could hop over a lot of areas of the community to get the city in place.
We've been there.
But
Don't want to go there again.
but so I'm glad you brought it up, because it sort of shines the light on at least our thinking about it. That's why I say this is probably the easy plan if you buy into that logic that we want our development to go where it's accommodated in the least kind of resourceful, intense way possible. Then this plan tries to do that. If you want to have utility departments chasing growth around and accommodating it with the limited funds we have, then that's a different plan altogether. If you want to,
As you say that.
Sure.
Development, so if you go develop and annex something and develop that area, does not that development pay for its way to put all of those streets, roads, utilities? It's not something that's put on the city. Don't they pay for that in that?
it pays the upfront cost to put those services in the ground, and then the community at large supports with tax dollars, which are generated in part by the new development, for that in perpetuity. And so if you put
And so that's the part that I keep hearing about, because we're talking about growth. Growth seems to be a bad word. And Commissioner Thelman said growth. Everybody said growth is a bad word, and I'm trying to understand when you say that.
Growth is not a bad word, and this, I think, I mean, this is sounding like this is the first meeting we've ever had. We established a long time ago that this is not an anti-growth committee, that our plan is not going to be anti-growth, but it's going to be thoughtful, sustainable growth. I think that's what we're trying for. It's not anti-growth.
And let me add that development doesn't pay for a new water tower or a fire station or the personnel that mans the fire station. That's all the community at large. And our only point is, when we need those things, let's do it in a logical way. Let's not allow growth to go sort of anywhere one landowner thinks it should be, accommodate it there, bypass all of this area that's reasonably expected to accommodate it, just in the name of being pro-growth. That's kind of our position in the matter. We've identified, and this plan, more than Horizon 2020 or any other plan before it, tried to use analytics more than anything to arrive at our conclusions. And again, it's not the answer. If you think that it makes more sense to go south of the Wakarusa treatment plant and open that area, that could be done too. That would direct the city resources to that area, and let's go do that area. I think that's the next round of, I think that's the third and fourth generation area, personally, but it's feasible. We could do it. We got 360 degrees of growth potential if you want to pay for it. And a lot of it is about what we want to pay for.
Well, but that's where we put our money
And
into
the development community does not pay for that kind of growth. The development community pays for the streets and utility services to accommodate that specific project. It doesn't pay for the community, the more major that we're talking about. When we talk about in Tier 3 of major utility system enhancements, we're talking about new water towers, the new treatment plant, adding on to the new treatment plant with
Well, that's
more
just
units.
exactly, so the treatment plant is south of town, and you put a new treatment plant there, so is it gonna help our infill inside? Will that, you follow what I'm asking you? And
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
where we've got it, so now are we gonna be able to lessen the structure on the one on 8th Street or whatever it is?
Exactly.
And that one's gonna support it, and so now, where does the development go? Because it sits out here, right? It sits out there south of the Walkie, and so where should you develop? Should it be in that area now? Is that what you're saying? Because
That's not a determinant in this discussion about growing south or growing west, because it will accommodate the western growth. In fact, it's planned mostly to do that first and then pick up other areas. And I guess that's what I'm talking about is utilities has informed this plan. This plan can inform utilities about where to put its resources as well in its planning efforts, because right now the treatment plant opens up the idea of growth both south of it and to the west. And all things considered, though, the south of the treatment plant won't accommodate it as much as the stuff to the west can. It has a lot to do with the fire response rates, the fire services, even I think planning for new streets and the adjacency of west of K10 versus south of the Wakarusa River and all it takes to supply it. We'll get there eventually. We will get there. Our conclusions are that this plan gets us to a point to accommodate growth in this planning horizon.
Scott, without an expansion of the new sewer plant, isn't it designed to take care of a full build-out of Tier 1 and Tier 2?
I believe so, or much of it, yes.
I thought that was always our plan.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's expandable,
Right.
as you know, so.
But it's only expandable when we decide to go to the south.
It depends on if we decide to keep going west, then it will need to be expandable to take that up. So what we've done is we've looked at certain areas of service, certain watersheds. Once you get going over some topography, then you've got to pump that sewer up. You got different water pressure zones, and this shouldn't be new to the committee. We've talked a lot about this, right? This idea of it, but it also has stirred a bit of a nest, because it's the first time we've decided to have this discussion about directing growth to an area that was more sort of intended with intention versus just accommodate any and all growth at any angle. And there was a time we were talking about growing into Grant Township and to the north, and because, you know, why? Because we could. We can go anywhere. That doesn't mean we should go anywhere. It means we should be more intentional about where we grow and how we grow.
Can I ask you on that? That's a nice segue to the, I have to say I was really interested in the note that came out from Michael Ullman that pointed to the south of the river, how our plan, our new plan, basically takes out the language, whereas the plan we have now says there shall not be development south of K10, according to Michael's letter, and that the new plan takes that language away and in fact makes a way for development in the south of K10, and that seems like a major shift in policy, especially given the turmoil, the current turmoil around development there. How do we arrive at that, what seems like a big policy shift?
So a couple of things. I guess we don't agree that the plan specifically, maybe a certain type of development south of K10, but there's annexed land south of K10 today. So it could develop under the current codes today. We see, and you know, this community has this barrier about South Lawrence Trafficway for some reason. We can't get past, we think of the city of Lawrence within South Lawrence Trafficway and never going outside of it. It's just a highway. And we see more the Wakarusa River being the real constraint there, because that's a major floodplain area, a very wide floodplain area. The highway is easy to navigate through with services. In fact, services are already under the highway there. It's going to be the same as we grow west. You dig under the highway, or you tunnel under, and you provide service. So I don't think it's quite the discrepancy that Mr. Ullman puts forward. The other thing to consider is that there's a pending comprehensive plan amendment to revise the current language that he cites. So that's all kind of in process.
And what are the plans for sector planning for south of K10, kind of the southern sector?
So so there's an existing sector plan that goes to the Wakarusa River. It's another interesting point you bring up about directing resources, right? For years, you have heard planning office talk about needing to do a sector plan south of the Wakarusa River. If this plan goes forward as presented to you, that will not be needed. We will be back at work in the west of K10 plan, probably revising it per the policies in here that talk more about neighborhood commercial and mixed housing types and different things like that. We won't need to do anything south of the Wakarusa if this is adopted for until the next planning cycle, the next 15, 20 years. So this plan would direct our work plan.
As long as we stick to the tier 1.
As long as you stick to this philosophy that we're outlining, yes.
I want to be clear, I like the tier.
I'm just still treading water over
Right,
here.
no. And I just think it's important, and
Yeah.
I appreciate your comment that it feels like our first meeting. I think some of the comments we got back were catching up to our first meeting a little bit, and I think it's important they hear our dialogue and thinking about it. I just think we have to make sure that whatever thresholds we put on that will impact our growth, and that we're okay with those impacts. That's to me is the crucial piece there. I love that we're using analytics. I think that's really great. I think that's super smart. I just want to make sure that we're okay with the thresholds we put on it.
Well, the question here is, does the 3-tier system stop development in this community?
Our opinion is it does not, but it does put some intentional analysis to it and some intention to directing it to areas of the community that's able to support it. That's a different viewpoint than we have had for decades. Our opinion is we can't afford not to do it a little more logically and intentional.
Patrick, can I ask you a question about what you said about going below sea level when it comes to tier 1? Looking at a neighborhood perspective, the historical context, basically after World War II, housing was commoditized. The single-family house was commoditized. And if you look at development patterns, not just in Lawrence, but other cities, you see these tiers of development on outer rings and outer rings and outer rings. And what you'll find is that the quality of the housing over time, by nature, by default, and because of code changes, gets better and better and better and better. In other words, if you look at the houses that are kind of around Iowa versus the houses that are way out in Wakarusa, better insulation, better services, all those kinds of things. As they become more attractive, which by default makes the houses on the inner rings less valuable. And what I don't see, or I guess going back to what you were saying earlier is, you're talking about either incentives or at least a reduction in complexity to be able to go into those inner ring neighborhoods and redevelop them or add density to those.
Was that a question?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I love that you're on this committee, John, because it makes me feel so dumb. So, I think I was moved by some of the commentary, and I've seen it in planning commission meetings when developers come and say, we're trying to do infill development here, but the minute we say we're going to redo a property, we've got to go to the new development code on a piece of property that was essentially started on the old development code. So think Iowa.
Right.
That might be a good example. And now we've got all these new curb cuts and new things that we've got to put in and new screenings and all that. I wish there was a tool, if we want to encourage infill development, that says maybe let's just get it in. It's better that it not be vacant, and that we actually, because we've put a big emphasis on infill development here, and at our retreat, we talked about the Target parking lot, for example. If somebody comes and Target, heaven forbid, goes out of business and somebody else comes in, can we look at our parking standards and say, maybe we don't need to put a tree in every corner of the lot and make it easier for somebody to use that space and more cost effective? I don't know the answer, and I think that's part of the struggle, is we want to see what that looks like. And Scott wants to get that, but we've got to put it in there to make it easier so that they're not looking to tier 2, that they want to be in tier 1 because it's so accommodating.
Well, it's like a blank canvas, right? Like, I can put it wherever I want, a blank canvas, tell me what the rules are. I'll put the streets in at this width and this many curb cuts, no problem. Yeah. I'm seeing the same thing. You give me this kind of infill thing, and I got to fit all this stuff in, but I've got to do all the same things I had to do in the blank canvas and fit it into this little tight spot. I can't do it. I hear the same thing.
This is a very helpful discussion.
Yeah.
I mean, it sort of seems like we're trying the whip approach on tier 2, to force them into tier 1, is that we want community benefits. So if you want to get out to tier 2, you better prove it.
Yeah.
And what I'd like to see is us make tier 1 more accommodating.
That's what I'm struggling with too, because the idea of restricting any growth, what you're asking to do or not to do, is antithetical to providing affordable housing. Creating a tier 2 and a tier 3 system already makes housing less affordable by default. So what are we going to do to allow for the pressure release off of tier 1 so that the market demand can still be met?
I think that's a good question. I don't necessarily have an answer for it. I think we're seeing on the Affordable Housing Board that exact discussion play out almost every meeting about how do you create these issues on one hand, try to solve it on this hand. It's a challenge, and it's nationwide. It's not Lawrence. It's national.
And I think from a neighborhood perspective, the challenge that I see is the very things that people want to preserve about their neighborhood. They're afraid of what proven solutions are. They're afraid of multifamily. They're afraid of ADUs. They're afraid of any kind of development pattern that's different than a single family home. which is, I think, the challenge that I hope we can address with this plan is to go back to that conviction that it's going to be okay, and really it's in the best interest of our inner neighborhoods to start to allow different housing types to be intermixed.
I don't think this restricts development and growth. I think it directs it intentionally so that the community cost of development isn't strained. That's how I phrase it. It's not restricting growth. We welcome it. I welcome the ability to talk to developers about the opportunities west of K10 in that area, because we're going to be there before we know, sooner rather than later, if our data is reflective. I mean, for example, most of you have been familiar with the rezoning and platting work done in the Wakarusa Legends area, that industrial business park zoning that was rezoned 30 some odd acres to single family and duplex development. Part of our analytics was our report that said we need some major subdivision of housing or we're going to be out before long. And so it was an infill piece that has sat for a very long time. It made sense in that particular instance to change that IBP to residential. Those are the kind of examples that we can look to say, yeah, that's sort of what we're trying to reflect in this new plan.
But I think one of the things that we need to be very careful of is when we talk about tier one and maybe easing up on, the requirements that we would have there to incentivize it, to make it happen, we got to make sure that if we are going to allow, a multiple family residential kind of thing, we still got to work our hardest to make sure that we protect the fabric of the neighborhood that it's going in. There is an appropriate level of what multiple family ought to be, and then there's one that's not. And I think that we need to remember those things also.
I think that's I don't know if you were asking about this, Nancy, when you said examples. I think that's the struggle that I have, is just the ignorance of what that looks like, because appropriately scaled, the multifamily that integrates and is appropriate for a neighborhood could be at densities 2 or 3 times what we call high density, and it still fit into a neighborhood we want. We just don't have any examples of it.
Well, we've got 2 areas that we know are called out through planning documents for more density. One is the area in the Oriad neighborhood alongside campus, where the HERE project has been built. That's an example of kind of intensifying that area. The other is downtown, and we're about to embark on a downtown master plan, get that going very early in 2018, and that will, I think, produce several sites of opportunity to intensify surface parking lots, for example, to address any number of values that we have: affordable housing and density, intensification, parking, walkability, all of those things, energy efficient construction, all of those kind of values. So I think there's a lot of opportunity yet to accommodate the growth that's coming.
Just have some general comments, and just thinking back to the years we've been working on this and what we really set out to do. We were looking at overarching values and things we wanted to encourage in our community. More growth, but infill rather than sprawl. Encouraging protection of sensitive areas, affordable housing. We had several things that are in the plan. Can we just say, there were comments about taking out shall languages and just encouraging all of those things and seeing how it would play out. I don't think we can do that. I think the plan has to say that we prioritize this over that and try to have a vision that creates some of all of that in a reasonable way, in a cost-effective way. I think cost-effectiveness and quality of life are the two issues that rose to the top for what we wanted to have in our community. My thought, and I thought that this is what we were going towards, was to have this document be the vision document, and that the details about how we encourage more infill development, for example, would be in code and mentioned in the implementation plan for how do we see this vision in our community. Well, we need we need code that encourages more infill. So many of the comments that we received, I think, are more appropriately placed at the code level and not in this plan. I think we have a lot more discussion on those things, but not necessarily about this document.
And is it possible to create examples of or draft language of what those codes would look like as this conversation about this plan goes along, so that they can be, the concern can be balanced with the possible solution down the road, but here's what it might look like?
We could do just about anything you ask us to do, but I'm not sure. I mean, yeah, I think, maybe a document more that introduces and expands upon the thoughts behind some of this new policy, because I do think this is new for the community. A lot of these items we haven't even talked about. Restricting development in floodplain, for example, would be a new concept for this community, and one again that is becoming more and more necessary. Sustainability, resiliency, and floodplain management, those aren't aspirations anymore for communities. They're requirements to move forward in the future, and from our perspective. And so I think that's what we need to demonstrate here. I don't know that it would help or hurt to have code examples come forward, maybe in concept. What does it mean, the floodplain regulation, for example? What does that actually mean? It means that we would go in and propose ordinances that say you cannot develop in the floodplain for newly annexed property. Not the stuff that's already in the city of Lawrence. I think there's some thoughts in the county level that they would do the same. And so that's the kind of code examples we could provide you. We could provide you examples when we talk about infill incentives, code changes that give staff more authority to negotiate out code values of parking and landscape buffering and lighting and that sort of thing, access points, that sort of thing. Both staff and the development the development community can be fickle a little bit, in that we both say that we want codes. Just tell us what the code is and we'll develop to it. The first project that comes in can't meet the code, and we both wish it were a little more flexible. So I think there's probably some opportunity there to adjust the code and give some ability to do that. So yeah, if tasked with that kind of exercise, I think we could put pen to paper.
Yeah, I think some kind of narrative or something that accompanies this throughout the conversation, so we don't constantly kind of fall into the abyss of, well, this isn't going to work because, and the actual solution for it is outside of this plan. But without you all producing something, we won't be able to point to the answer, to the potential solution that makes this make sense. So I think something needs to be created to help all the commissions that are going to be facing, these tough criticisms and questions to help us along. And I don't know where, I think the other thing that there would need to be some reassurance on would be that those actual policy changes, those actual code changes would be enacted relatively soon after the adoption of the plan, because sometimes it takes us years to make even nominal changes in our regulations. And I think the plan itself could just kind of fall under its own weight without the policies and the regulations to back it up.
We're sensitive to that issue as well. That would be.
And the timeline is not you all.
Sure.
You're not staffed up probably adequately in process.
That would take place of the south of the Wakarusa sector plan would be implementing the new comprehensive plan as an example.
Yeah.
Well, since we've gone ahead and moved on to the discussion of the updates to the draft plan, and we've done the first one quite a bit, Is there any other items that we want to specifically direct staff to do on the rewrite of the growth management and the tiers?
I'll just say I appreciated the comments from Mary and the Douglas County zoning. I thought they were very, it does feel like a city-heavy plan and want some of those same applications out in the county. So, I don't know. I talked to Jeff today about that. Yeah.
And chairs, if you task us with going back and taking all this into account, the other thing I would offer is that we would be happy to meet with any one of the commenters that submitted comments to us and have a dialogue with them. If you're tasking us with kind of taking their input into consideration, we'd like to hear from them and talk to them one-on-one about it.
I think that's appropriate after, I was glad to see, like you said earlier, the amount of comment we got. As long as we've been doing this, all of a sudden, now we have a lot of comment. You know,
Well, we've had years
haven't-
of comment.
Well, but
We
not
have
nearly
a
this
lot of-
volume of, and specifics, you know, so now they've seen the specifics.
We find it's helpful to put something out and have them react to it.
Well, and this is also the first time that the draft plan
Yeah.
has been before anybody.
Well, and
Everything else, there was the issues, action items, or this list or that list. So I think it kind of motivated, generated, inspired some, okay, this is it now, so.
I think that's a testament to staff and Jeff for putting together something that's readable. And it could be that a lot of these folks can now access this plan where the previous plan wasn't as readable, so that's achieved one of the high-level goals in that regard. It has spurred comment because it is readable. It's successful at being readable. Whether people like it or not are two different things, but it's achieved that goal, which I think is great.
now we need jobs, and we've covered both of
Yeah,
them.
there you go.
Top two,
Are you hiring?
always.
One of the interests I had, and I don't know whether this is the time or not, is when we first met 3.5 years ago, the city did not have a strategic plan. What's up on the wall over there? It just didn't have it, okay? And so we've continued to develop the comprehensive plan, not necessarily at the exclusion of the strategic plan, but I would like to think that when this goes before the governing bodies, and I hope I'm not being naive, that they're going to pull out their strategic plan and see, okay, how does a comprehensive plan mesh with, align with our 2-year strategic plan? Because by the time they see our plan, this will already be a year old, their strategic plan. So I don't know what the tool is to say when they look at this, the comprehensive plan, and say, okay, so how does this help, hurt, or have no effect on this priority that we've identified in the strategic plan?
You know, there's a diagram in the comp plan that reflects sort of this circular process. Can you bring it up on, well, we can't, maybe Jeff, because it's a good question, yeah. So that diagram has at the top the comprehensive plan, which is the biggest view, right, and the longest time horizon. And then underneath that is the strategic plan, and then the CIP, and so that each plan gets shorter and more concise and precise, right? When Tom Marcus came on board now a couple of years ago, if I'm close to accurate, he had a great desire to get the governing body of Lawrence anyway involved with strategic planning, fully understanding, in fact he brought this to us, this diagram, fully understanding that it was a little bit out of order, but it's so valuable that it's okay if it's a little bit messy, that it will catch up to itself as we start cycling through this process of planning. So that was done intentionally, that the governing body was doing the strategic plan, but I can tell you that they're very much in touch with this, to the point where even last week, a city commissioner brought us to the attention of the planning commission about their strategic plan and how it dovetails into the comprehensive plan work. And I don't know, Commissioner Amyx, if you want to say anything more about that.
No, I think the process that Tom brought forward was, it would catch up and it would meld together, so it seemed like to me it was gonna work, and, by updating the strategic plan every couple of years, we're bound to look at all of it as one big unit, so I think it
You can really start
But it
anywhere.
needs to work the other way too. For example,
Right.
if the city in their strategic plan has safe, healthy, and welcoming neighborhoods as one of its 7 critical success factors. Is there anything in the new redesigned, brand new, comprehensive, updated plan that furthers that, helps it, supports it, or doesn't?
And I would argue
And maybe that's not a
yes.
bad thing either, because I guess I just want to see more of a direct linkage between the comprehensive plan and now this strategic plan, which didn't exist before. We know
Correct.
it, but now it does. We can't ignore it though either.
And the link that we're offering is this education about how they all should work together. And so typically, the strategic plan doesn't necessarily inform the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan should inform the strategic plan. Again, it was a start. We started with it. And then ultimately, after the comprehensive plan is adopted, the strategic plan should start falling in line with that. But you're right, we have the benefit of knowing the city's goals. So I would argue, and we have reviewed this in the context of those goals, we think there's policy support in the comprehensive plan as proposed to support the city's strategic plan. A lot of it has to do with this addition of neighborhood language and policies in the new plan.
And Bill, that's why I asked the question, as we look at maybe incentivizing infill, does that maybe fly in the face of the goals of the strategic plan when the governing body is that, strong neighborhood?
We talk about incentivizing, and
Maybe that's the wrong word.
because I was just going to say, if we would just lower the requirements of some of it, that would be an incentive.
Absolutely.
And so I just want to make sure that we're on the same page of those. We don't have to spend money on it, we just need to give them the ability to do something.
Right.
Improving the code through subtraction.
Well, I like the framing.
Excellent.
The framing of it is to, not because think about incentivize, you're thinking usually monetarily or something like that, or more density or intensity. It's really about reducing the threshold, reducing the hurdles to do infill development,
To make it cost effective.
Right.
make it attractive to
Mhm.
Okay. Any other direction you need on that, Scott?
No, sir?
Okay. And you will look at incorporating the public comments that have come forward in that also?
Correct.
Okay.
I think if you task us with, unless there's anything else that you saw that you want to direct us on, we will have some decisions to make about a lot of the nuances, the specific comments. And we had a lot of them. So, what I don't want to necessarily do is get into it kind of writing by committee kind of thing. That's just going to be very difficult. It's going to strive, perfect is the enemy of good kind of discussion. But if you task us with that, you'll get another look at it. After we've gone back and taken all these comments into consideration, probably had a few meetings with the commenters. We'll bring a different version back to you. We'll try to make sure we put it in a form that you can see the differences, distinctions, so you don't have to reread it all anew. But
Please say you.
Just comment on that in terms of meetings with commenters. I think it's important for the integrity of this committee that if those meetings are going to cause you to change emphasis, change direction, change policy, I think that's probably beyond a private meeting between you and commenters.
I would agree. One thing we could do is just document any such meeting, kind of make that available in a transparent way to the group, the public.
Would it be possible to just take these one chapter at a time and have that dialogue publicly?
In what form? I think
Well, for me, it seems like we spent most of today on a section on growth and development. And I'm, don't want to derail that conversation, but I'm curious about other sections, and there clearly isn't enough time to dig into that. So it seems like it could be helpful to signal to the public, this next meeting, we're going to dig into this certain chapter, and people can prepare themselves, even maybe give us a chance to hear them directly, or require public written comment, either way. But then to kind of focus the conversation for that meeting on that topic. And
So I would say a couple of things. One is, it depends on the committee's time and how much time you have to devote to this and how many more meetings we have with it. I think we've had a lot of meetings. You've built an issue action report with the benefit of a lot of public participation. We've seen a lot of the comments now. I would say a lot of the comments were great comments, a great look at this. We're very willing to accept, many of them that don't conflict with where we think the committee has landed on these issues. Some of it's wordsmithing, some of it's sort of enhancing a policy here and there, that sort of thing. I think the opportunity here is to say what high-level policy issues are before you based on the comments you received that you want to redirect and see a different outcome on. Charlie, I'd leave it to the committee to decide how many more meetings you have and how deep you go in these things. But I know when I think about the work ahead of us, it's pretty intense. It's pretty long hours. It's a lot of time with it. And I feel like this committee has put in a lot of time to get the basics out and get a product out. But I leave it to the other members.
well, it's mostly getting to is how do you get we used to meet pretty regularly. Then we went into kind of a hibernation while the plan was being drafted. And now we've met a few times this year. So it seems like you're suggesting we go back into a mode where staff is going to work perhaps one-on-one with anyone that submitted comments. And then at some point at the end of that, there'll be a new version of the plan brought back to us. And not sure how long that's going to take, and if it would be easier just to have that in a more public process.
So I think you have the ability, after you see that edition come back to you, to do that very thing. I think that, in my opinion, is probably more fit, because we got a lot of great comments. I think somebody, one entity needs to take the time to cull through those, make decisions about what to accept and what to reject, frankly, in terms of the comment, make that transparent, let you all see that process on paper, report back to you those things, and then I think reserve that ability to go deeper with it. That would be my proposal to you. Certainly there are different ways to do it.
And that process is probably 60 to 90 days out, right?
I believe it would be, yes.
At least you have a lot of comments.
There's a lot of comments, just fast.
We've invested a lot of time in this already, and I have no problem investing more in it as we move forward, because I think now we're starting to hone it down and get all of the true statements from everyone in the community. So I think it's nothing but positive.
I've had 3 children since we started. I guess I have 3 more.
Well, 2 of those were twins, though, right?
Oh, cheating.
Yeah. Just to be clear.
You've been productive at least.
Well, I say that we give staff the flexibility of being able to go through and incorporate the comments, not only of this body, but also that of the public that's generously come forward and presented ideas in various topics of this report. I mean, it's an incredible amount of work. I would do we have comments? Obviously, you need comments on the big picture items that you've listed. I think we ought to spend time, the remainder of our time, going through these if we could. Lisa, did you have something else a second ago?
I just had a question for staff on, we received comments from different people that conflict
Right.
You know, if you go one direction, someone's going to be unhappy. If you go this direction, that person will be unhappy. So how do you plan to do that?
Well, we're
Approach that.
going to use what we understand the steering committee's position to have been
Mhm.
throughout our development of this.
Okay.
That's been our gauge all along, yeah.
Yeah.
But you're right, we've got some extremes on almost every
You
issue
do.
and everything in between.
I mean, I kind of agree with Mike and Charlie both in a way. I mean, give the staff 60 to 90 days, come back with a revised document that incorporates comments from the last 90-day public comment period. And then if we have some significant issues with how it may have been incorporated, then we could have a follow-on meeting and look at chapters more in detail. Some of those chapters.
Well, it may behoove us to, at the end of that staff revision time, put it out for more public review, steering committee review, and bring the steering committee back to hear from the public at the podium. Perhaps that's a way to sort of get more input. That way they have the benefit of seeing what revisions, and they can still argue if they didn't get their idea incorporated, they can argue more for it. If it needs to be tweaked, whatever the case may be. It might be the way we handle that next meeting.
Well, is there a way for you to track your, I mean, not the little wordsmithing, grammatical stuff, but when you've been persuaded by someone you've talked to and you've gone in and changed some of the narrative?
Yeah, I think we can
track that, so we
track that.
can, as we're reading the new draft, we can see in that same reading what was
Yes, I think that's an important part of it, is to be transparent about what our discussion was, or what we accepted, what we didn't accept, those sorts of items.
So whenever we arrive,
The idea of meeting with stakeholders isn't to be persuaded one way or the other, but to share ideas and share information, because when I read through a lot of the comments, a lot of it may have been from a misinformed position from our perspective. And if we need to be educated on misinformation that we have from their perspective, it's that exchange of information and ideas that's important.
That'd be great.
so whenever we arrive at the best informed version, that will go to the Planning Commission. They'll come up with a recommendation for the governing bodies, right? And they may or may not have any hearings with it.
So
Is that right?
next steps after it comes out of steering committee, we talked a little bit about having a joint work session with the Planning Commission, City Commission, and County Commission to just inform them of what the plan is, advise them of what the plan is, take any discussion that they have together to individual governing bodies, and then start around between the Planning Commission, City Commission, and County Commission. If we've done our job right at that point, there's not a lot of conflict in there, but there may still be. But at least everyone is starting with an understanding of what the plan is. So when we get to each body, they know that they've all had a chance to kind of look at it together, talk a little bit about it, and know what the issues are.
And they will also have opportunities to get public input,
Absolutely.
which could be significant enough to turn around and come back to you all and say, okay, we think this needs to be relooked.
Correct.
And John has a basketball team by then.
It's a pretty vicious
It's going to be a good
process.
plan. It's not coming back. It's going to be a good plan. It's not coming back.
Okay, do we have any other changes then to the environmental chapter and climate change? Say more.
I think there were a lot of comments that we're
There
going to
were.
look at, but if there's anything sort of pressing by anybody, we're happy to hear that right now.
And you will again talk to the individuals if you have questions about comments and various things on how to incorporate.
If we will reach out to them, or they can reach out to us.
something.
When I would just say on the environment climate change. I would guess that would go to the natural resources stuff. I really appreciated, I thought the Food Policy Council did a great job. And they're so well tuned into the comp plan and have actually helped so much with it that I would really hope that we could incorporate their suggestions. I think they were very good.
Did any of the possible plan names that came out stick or not? Does anybody?
Now, we'll get to that in a minute. Hold on, Joe. Economic development.
Oh, you worked through that, okay.
Contact with Kevin at Peasley. Make sure that we've incorporated Peasley into that discussion also. Affordable housing.
This one probably is the fastest moving of all topics, of new topics in the plan. And, you know, the thing we'll note there is just our incorporation of what's yet to come into the plan is the most value I think the plan has.
Okay, that'd be great. Anyone else on that?
I will say that the plan reflects what's happened to date with the Affordable Housing Board and the City Commission's work in terms of the definition of affordable housing and that sort of thing.
Would their, you know, the housing inventory, the housing study,
Right.
is that something that would be incorporated? Will that be a separate outside study? Is that something that should be incorporated when it's done?
You know, it's going to be a tool to advise the affordable housing discussion. So I think through that way, the outcomes get incorporated.
Is that going to be a snapshot of the day? Or is it going to be a document that we can use for several years?
I think it will be a document we use for several years, but those types of studies need to be renewed every so often because it's a tool. It is a snapshot of your housing market and conditions of the time. So it will need to be reviewed and renewed occasionally.
Okay, guys, put a name on this. Thrive lasted how long?
Well,
I don't think that was ever quite as serious.
that depends on if you ever really gave it credence.
Perpetual?
We put this list out in front of the committee to see what grabbed you.
I did want to jump back to affordable housing really quickly because I know that there was a study done on the building codes to kind of determine if there were some cost savings that could be made, and without sacrificing environmental concerns through reducing from uniform building code from 2x6 construction to 2x4 construction. There really isn't any cost savings on building codes, which means the cost savings goes back to the issues of supply and density. And I think it's important to recognize that those issues about density beginning the plan really are what lead to affordable housing. It's not that affordable housing isn't a prescriptive thing, but if we're going to get affordable housing, it's going to come from the zoning code, not from the building code. That's the biggest comment that I would take away from that.
I think you're right. The cost of a carpenter, or cost of plumbing equipment and all this stuff is the cost.
But if
And
you have a shared wall, now your cost goes down. If you got shared floors, your cost goes down. If you have less parking you've got to put down, your cost goes down. So that's where the cost savings is, and that goes back to that density argument. Okay.
so since we have nobody jumping up and wanting to name the comprehensive plan, updated comprehensive plan, think about it. Oh, Patrick's got one.
Not
I can
our
tell.
exception.
Patrick's got it.
That's not a good idea.
And New Horizons is the name of a
Yeah, a
Band,
band,
so-
that's not a good one either. CRC, 4, 5, we can cross them off. Not a
Well, you can argue for or against it, but if you keep the name Horizon in it somehow, it will convey, at least to the community at large, that this is an update of an existing plan. If you call it something else totally different, it'll be like, wait a minute, whatever happened to... That'd be only one point to consider.
How about thumbs up emoji? How's that?
So if we're striving for alignment with other plans we have, the transportation plan is Transportation 2040. That's why I think Plan 2040 got on a list, as creative as it is.
So Horizon
It does.
2040, is that what you're trying to say?
Well, no,
Just boost her up by 20 years?
Plan 2040.
Well, I know, but you said we want to keep Horizon in so everybody understands it's the
Well.
same type of, which I kind of agree with. You got to keep it consistent in what you're doing moving forward.
Yeah. My thought
Horizon
was-
Plan 2040? How's that?
No, I wasn't going to Horizon. I was going for a new strategy of aligning our plan sort of language. Transportation 2040, Plan 2040, and then if we had others that kind of fall in line with that. Just an idea.
I thought early on, it was said that the planning, best practices in planning were saying that comp plans were going away from numbered kind of years, time horizons, because it sets up that kind of false pressure to, like,
At the same
it
time,
just sets you
we're
up.
using
But we need it.
I know, I mean, we're
We would
thinking
argue
about that.
analytics, and we've said
Yeah.
over the next 20 years.
I'm just saying what I thought
Yeah,
we said in the
I remember
beginning
that.
was that wasn't considered best practice anymore to use time-limited titles in your comp plan.
Since we're 4 years in, maybe it'll
Yeah.
Horizon 2044 or something.
You're right. I mean, it's trendy. Depends on where you're at. But I agree that the 2040 is the kind of the planning period. So it may work.
I think putting some sort of year or time in there actually helps drive accountability for the plan. You won't let it go past. Or somebody will call you to task. Say, wait a minute, this ended last year. Where's your new one?
That's how we got to this point with 2020.
Yeah.
And we're going to get there. We're going to make
We'll
2020.
get there. That's the goal.
3 more to go. We're there.
Horizon 2040, just because majority of people know Horizon.
The date in there.
I have a comment, though, just before,
Be-
seems like we're wrapping up. I just sort of want to support something that Charlie said earlier. Maybe this is a little bit for the public. I think we have to have a clear how we're going to discuss parts of the plan. And if we're going to, I know we've done a ton of work on the front side, but I may have prepared, maybe I didn't understand, prepared differently if I knew we were just going to look at the report and then give it back to staff to make all the changes that we just read about. I may have just read them, not thought of any comments, and then just be interested. I'm just not sure how we're functioning best to keep it a transparent process. And maybe it is good to take it, as Charlie suggested, chapter by chapter, and say, okay, we're going to dedicate 30 minutes to this chapter and talk about, because I think sometimes we get on that growth chapter and I talk way too long, and then we're 45 minutes into it and we're running out of time, so we just did what we, boom, 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 and we're done. And I worry that that isn't giving enough attention to all of the stuff. So I just toss it
Well,
back.
and you know, I know that a lot of the comments talked about an abbreviated public comment review period or the first time, this kind of stuff. But I think by taking this as the initial set of input, working it up, again, you don't lose that ability to do just that. It's like we had to start big, get hundreds of pages of comments, and first call through those, kind of start whittling the topics down. So I don't mind taking this whatever time the committee needs with it.
I
So-
like the approach that you're doing, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
To incorporate these comments now. I think you're going to have some tough decisions, and maybe you can't incorporate them all, but give us a choice to consider. But to do that work, and then we should go through it chapter by chapter.
And that's what we
take
did
the time to do it.
previously, was bring you decisions that we weren't able to make on our own, or felt like we could make on our own.
Okay, so the committee in agreement then that once the document's done, then the committee will go through it chapter at a time? Just so the public knows what we're doing?
But I don't think we necessarily have to look at it one chapter per week, per meeting.
No.
I think it can be,
No.
we can be efficient with our
Right,
time.
right. Okay. Then that'll be the plan, and we'll advertise that as to what we'll be doing. Okay?
Yep.
Can you give us a time frame as to when we'll be back?
I heard 90 to 120 days.
I was just talking.
I heard
I thought it
60
was
to
60
90.
to
120, so.
I buy myself some time. It's a priority for us, so we'll try to do our best to. It always helps to get that doodle poll out, get a date set, and then work toward that date. Sometimes setting that limit so that we're making sure to make it a priority. So yeah, I think within the 3-month period, you'll be meeting again, having that next step, taking that next step.
And I for one, am fine after that if we want to increase the frequency to every 3 weeks or once a month or something until we, get through knocking it all out.
Yeah, maybe we'll think about how we can divide up the chapters in a set of meetings, 2 or 3 meetings worth. Maybe we'll try to get that series on your calendar so that we have that time blocked off.
I think you ought to all meet weekly.
You will.
Only if you're still here. If you're here, no problem.
I think if there's any way to, I mean, we're kind of joking about how long this can take, but 60 days versus 90, that's another month, and then maybe meeting every 3 weeks or so. That's, I mean, I do think the community is paying attention now. People have read, they're going to want to stay invested, and I think if there's any way we can be closer to 60 than 90, and if there's any way we can meet every week or every other week and get this closer to being done. I don't think, we're losing Mike, we're losing Marcel, we're losing, I mean, it's just like, I know that you only have so many hours in the day and only so much staff to do this work, but.
Well, I think that the amount and level of detail comments we received back surprised us a little bit, and it will take some time to work through all of those. But yeah, we will definitely make it priority. I can't tell you exactly how long it's going to take. Maybe after we meet with staff and kind of get together as a follow-up to this, we'll get a better understanding of the work involved. Again, I think the next thing you'll hear from us is trying to lay out that series of 2 or 3 meetings, calendarize those, and then work toward that date, and we'll just make that happen.
But you have the holidays coming up. I mean, so it's gonna be stretched to try to do it in a short time period.
I know, but I just think I just think it's important to know that
We want to keep the momentum
there's
going.
more to do than this too, and you all need to be able to focus on other things as well. So if we can be sooner rather than later,
You
I
want
think we
draft
can.
code language?
And by the way, no.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a privilege. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
Unbelievable.
on that note, because you're right, the next time we meet, I think we already decided that we wouldn't put the second planning commissioner on because thought we were kind of toward the end. Commissioner Amyx will fall off the committee, and somebody mentioned Marcel, but I'm not.
He said he wasn't for sure, but his time's up in January, so.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, isn't it?
His is in July. School board, don't they change in July?
No, it changes in January.
January now? Okay.
Just like you guys.
So I think the question is, do we work to fill those 3 seats? Or go through the final steps without filling those seats?
I'll make an argument for filling it, just because since the plan then goes to the city commission and the planning commission, that I think just, we all have to do a good job of not starting the conversation all over. Sometimes I join late, and sometimes I feel like I'm starting the conversation over. We have to make sure we don't do that, but just so they understand where some of these ideas are coming from.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it'd be effort or time lost, because while we hope that we'll never see it again, you never know.
Yeah.
And then it would have been helpful to have had a couple more bodies at least through the next 3-4 months, whatever, how long it takes.
I think it makes sense just from a quorum issue. As
Yeah.
well.
Particularly if we're going to go through chapters.
Yes.
We want to have that quorum to be able to do that.
Okay, so we'll work to try to do that too.
Have we lost anybody else that we're missing
Missing Kyra,
Kyra,
but
and she's still on though?
she's still on, so I think that's it.
Patrick, you're termed out in May,
No, I have one more after that.
in 2019? Okay. Is Brian that terms out? No, one of you guys is gonna be.
Yeah, the way Sheila figures it out is sort of dangerous, so yeah. Yeah. I have one more year, but then I could be reappointed for another 3 years.
Oh.
Patrick will be here.
With that comment, without a doubt, Sheila,
If willing,
If willing to
if willing and
you
appointed.
just made it to 2022.
That's all we have.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike.
Entertain a motion to adjourn.
Moved.
Motion made and seconded to adjourn. Lisa and Scott, all in favor, aye?
Aye.
Opposed? We're adjourned.